This is the Roller Coaster Podcast, and I'm your host, Lucy Q. Life is a wild ride. It has twists and turns. It's scary, exciting, and downright fun. So throw your head back, arms in the air, and come along with me for the ride.
Life is like a roller coaster, baby, baby. I wanna ride.
Bereavement, isolation, loss of income, and fear are all global pandemic side effects. They're acting like accelerants being poured on an already fragile mental health crisis. Many people are facing increased levels of alcohol and drug use, insomnia, and anxiety. Today is a chosen day by a major Canadian corporation to focus on mental health. But honestly, at this point, I feel that things like these types of campaigns are nothing more than marketing ploys, because the only thing that has changed is that the problem has gotten worse. Personally, I've known too many people that have left this world in the past 2 years because it has all become too much. Joining me today is Peyton Garland to chat about her book, Not So By Myself, and continuing the conversation on the mental health crisis. Welcome to the roller coaster, Peyton.
Hey, happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start off by why is, the mental health situation, why is that so important to you right now?
It's such a crazy timing. I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety and secondary PTSD in November of 2019. So right before all of the COVID stuff. So I consider it quite a bittersweet blessing in my life. So for me, it was important because I lived my life in a way where I thought that I had to be perfect and I had to check all the boxes and show up for everybody in the right way, smile on cue, say the right words on cue. And I've been living my life in a state of exhaustion and misery, because not only was I not able to be perfect all the time, but I was battling several mental health diagnoses without even knowing it. And so for me, showing up in a vulnerable space and finally realizing something's wrong, for me, that was freeing for my soul.
How did you identify that you had these mental health diagnoses to deal with? Because, something like OCD, people somewhat joke about, oh, I have OCD, I do this, I do that. So for you, how did that manifest in your life, and how did you go about getting that professional diagnosis for it?
You're so right about OCD, because it's only really been coined since the 80s. And so we haven't had a lot of psychology that's just hardcore facts around it. And so as a result, it is stereotyped very easily. Most people think you just got to organize all your clothes in a color coordinated fashion, or you have to have a really neat workspace. But for me, it manifested probably in the toughest, hardest way when I'd just gotten married. And my husband decides he's going to quit his 9-to-5 job working as a sales rep for the Atlanta Falcons, so for a professional football team. And he's decided he wants to be a pilot. That means I end up taking on 3 jobs at once so he can go to flight school. And right when he finishes flight school, the only airport with a job available was 8 hours from home. So there was all this financial stress, all this emotional stress. Everything was building up. And then the one person I could vent to was gone. And it was just Peyton and Peyton's thoughts. And I finally had to wrestle with this idea that distractions weren't working. The thoughts in my head were getting very loud. And whether it was actually a clinical diagnosis or not, I wasn't okay. And the only way I was going to be okay was to be open and honest and talk to a professional.
What were those distractions that you had?
Definitely the cell phone. It's really easy to scroll. It's pretty mindless. But what I've discovered is our brains are never mindless. We might not feel like we are present in a thought, but all I did was I kept giving myself other reasons to compare myself to other people. I gave myself reasons to be jealous of other couples who were living under the same roof. So that distraction not only didn't distract me, but it just made things 20 times worse. And actually in my book, my first chapter is all about distractions. I took my 2 dogs, Alfie and Daisy, to the dog park because I didn't want to sit at home by myself because I didn't want to face myself. And Alfie, my big dog, ends up trying to do the dirty on a poor 3-legged female dog in the park, starts a complete riot. Like, he is at the bottom of a 50 dog alpha male pile. And we essentially get kicked out of the dog park that day. So I learned very quickly, distractions from cell phones to dogs having sex in public doesn't go well. Like, it's just not going to work.
You must have been sitting there like shit, really? Like,
I was thinking to myself, I saw the pile, but I didn't see my dog. And something in me said, that's your Alfie. So I just sprint across the park. Owners are yanking their dogs out of the mound. And lo and behold, it was my Alfie on top of that poor 3-legged female dog.
oh, good God. I mean, I shouldn't laugh, but I mean,
No,
I'm sure you can look back at the humor of it, because it's like, oh, good God.
That's a fan favorite for readers now for that very purpose. So I laugh about it too.
Yeah. Yeah. And, earlier you touched on a very important, there's 3 things I pinpointed in what you've said. Is you talked about checking the boxes, and I refer to that as that dreaded checklist, that cultural checklist that is, attached to us at birth, where thou shalt do all of these things that we tell you to do, and you shall be happy. And then suddenly you wake up one day and you're like, no, I'm not.
Right.
You talked about perfection. And I think the underlying message that I sort of see there, and I can relate to, is that battling the I'm not enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that is so true, because I think yourself. And when you have OCD, and it's quite literally a diagnosis that reflects your inner thoughts that are compulsive, that are intrusive, that you don't want, you're battling demons no one else can see. And so it doesn't matter how many people tell you they love you, how many people say you're worth it. You're going, nope, I'm not. I know my brain. I know my thoughts. I know me better than you. So there's no way I am good enough or worthy enough to show up in this space with other people.
And those voices, the voice that we hear in our heads, that criticizing self-critical voice, or, again, another one of my terms is the itty bitty shitty committee. It runs itself off. And, even though you can grow past a certain point, I've been on this sort of self-exploration, this self-growth journey for, about 4 years now. And it just hit me on Monday that I thought that I had fired that committee in my head, because I don't know exactly how I was distracting myself from it, but it was there and it showed itself. And I thought, oh my God, I suddenly saw, the limiting beliefs that I was putting on myself. I was seeing that I was telling myself that I was not enough. I was doing all of those things that, no matter how far you think you've come, they always seem to, pop up when you least expect it.
Well, for sure. I think that is actually the total opposite of perfection, is imperfection. And yet we don't want to accept that imperfection is a reality, that, it's the new year. I was totally upset on January 2nd because I'd already botched some of my own New Year's resolutions. And I thought, 24 hours and you slept for half of them. Like, what are you doing, kid? Get with it. And so I totally relate to this shame. I think it's a shame that we put on ourselves because we have yet to accept that imperfection, it isn't just part of our nature, but it's part of our growing process.
But we are, as human beings, perfectly imperfect. There is no such thing as perfection. And I'd like to meet the person that tried to tell us that we need to be perfect.
Yeah.
I'd like to know where this came from.
Yeah, for real. We could have our own committee around that. And I think for me, that's what's so interesting. I grew up in a religious background in a Christian home. And for years, the church leaders painted God as someone who just had lightning bolts, almost like Zeus, and he was just waiting on you to mess up. And so
yes,
I grew up living this idea that fear was my calling. I was called to be afraid, not out of respect, not out of a reverent fear, but out of just this total idea that the second you step out of line, it's over, period. There's no going back. There's no moving forward. You are frozen. You are imperfect. That is where you're going to be, and you deserve shame. And so it took years, and it took lots of therapy to discover that that was quite literally religious trauma. That was another diagnosis that got thrown in the mix. But I think the beautiful thing is, the older I got, getting married to my husband, and that whole career change throwing me for a loop, it was in the face of my imperfection that I realized that God has invited me into a space of grace. And the reality is, until I give myself grace, I can't give other people grace. If I am over here super rigid with myself, how on earth am I loving other people and giving them the space to mess up and to be human and to grow and to learn?
Yeah, so true. And, I was raised with a church.
Mhm.
There were not conversations of God at home, but we went to church every Sunday.
Sure.
And certainly through my early years, the priest was that old scary dude that stood at the pulpit and just like banged out his sermon.
Right.
And, I probably harbored a few things from that, but, for me, I think I took a different route, and I rebelled.
Yeah.
I started to question everything, because that was just in my nature. It's like, well, wait a second, who says this? Who says that this is how it, I mean, I was no better off, because I was even more confused, and I was alienating my parents through all of this. But these different traumas or points of hurt are woven throughout our lives, and they become a part of us, so much so that we don't even know that they're there.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what makes it so hard is, I spilled my guts to my therapist, because day one, it is like the movies, where this very peaceful looking person across from you has a notepad and they just start writing everything you're saying. So I'm over here telling her everything from A to Z. And, she looks at me and smiles, and she said, okay, we don't have to go. You have OCD, you have anxiety, you have secondary trauma, you have religious trauma. She said, but just understand, if you knew then what you know now, you wouldn't carry the shame and the weight. You would understand that you are free to ask questions. You are free to say, I am not okay. You are free to be angry at God. And all of a sudden I just went, oh, really? I can be human? Like, that's allowed? Because I've been trying to be not human for over 25 years. And I am, quite frankly, exhausted, and I'm bitter, and I'm tired, and I am angry. And so I think the healing for me literally came from the truth that not only are you imperfect, but that's okay. And there's so much room to grow when you're allowed to ask questions and mess up, and just step into a space where you don't know what on earth you're doing.
And being okay with it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And how did you navigate that, sitting with yourself, that aloneness, and how did you use that as a tool for self-exploration?
Well, yeah, sitting by myself, it took, my husband was gone for a good 3 or 4 months, and it took a full month for me to realize I was just utterly distracting myself. As if the dog park wasn't enough. Dumb me just thought we would keep exploring other ways to wreck life. But about a month in, once I finally said, okay, you have got to sit with yourself, it was quite literally that. My therapist taught me, it sounds strange. She said, but get a picture of you from your childhood. Go find a picture of you where you look happy, where you look joyful, where you look carefree. You look at that picture and you start talking to her. And that was pretty much the only direction I was given. It sounded very strange. I was not a fan of this, but I found this little picture of me on the beach in my little mermaid swimsuit, throwing water in the air. And I just held it up, and I looked at Peyton, like 3 or 4-year-old Peyton. And out of nowhere, I start saying, hey, you're going to be okay. Hey, you're going to go through hard things, but you'll be here on the other side of this. And out of nowhere, I'm affirming all these truths to my younger self. And what I'm doing is I'm paving the way for my past to be healed and to be whole. And the reason I think I was so not okay in the middle of the present is I hadn't wrestled with the past. I hadn't come to peace with it either. And so just being willing to talk through things I never wanted to unbox and pull out of my closet and just spill on the floor, that for me was when silence, sitting in that quiet and letting thoughts kind of navigate through my brain, that's when I found purpose and all that. And I'll be honest, I also found purpose in some very raw, honest prayers that weren't very, like you said, religious. I remember looking at God one day and saying, "What the hell are you doing, man?" And that was my prayer. I don't know what you're doing. I don't like it. I'm too stubborn to leave you. Like, so I'm going to sit here, but you should just know I'm very angry and I'm not okay. And so just this give and take of finding freedom and just being raw and honest, and then finding this freedom and talking to my younger self and just reaffirming that healing is possible. That's when I wasn't distracting myself any longer. I was dealing with things.
It's funny you mentioned the picture of you being a kid. I know you can't see it clearly, but about right there over my shoulder, there's an 8x10 picture of me. And I think I'm going to say I was maybe 7. And I've got this, my hair is all typical of me. I was, my hair is all a mess. I'm sitting on my front step. I've got this big grin on my face. I've got, one adult tooth and a bunch of baby tooth. I've got this like jack-o'-lantern smile. And I don't know why, but I put it on my shelf. And after a while, I started looking at it and I started talking to that little girl and saying, "You have no idea what you're going to do. You have no idea what you're going to accomplish." So I find it very interesting that was, a tool that your therapist gave you.
Absolutely. It sounds strange. It feels strange. But when I made it almost like a ritual, I started talking to myself every night in the bathroom and things worked.
And, on the topic of God, that's actually a subject that I've gotten much more comfortable talking about through podcasting.
Yeah.
Because I've spoken to several people about it, because I mentioned earlier, I rebelled against the church.
Sure.
But I always associated God with the church. I never understood that there was a separation. And it's only very recently that I'm like, well, no, of course. Yeah. The God, the universe, we're all connected. We all have a responsibility to one another. It's just that for some people, the cloak of religion, dampens, I don't know how to say it, but it makes it harder for some people to connect. Not everybody. I mean, I have friends that are, right in there and, full on in church, and that's great. That's fantastic to have that community.
Right.
That's just not something that made sense to me, probably because I don't like rules.
Sure.
And church has too many rules.
Well, and I think what happens oftentimes in the church is there's rules for the sake of rules, because there's way less work in checking off a box than wrestling with your own heart and really checking up and seeing, am I loving people well? Am I being honest? Am I being as forgiving as I want to be forgiven? And I think checking a box doesn't take near as much effort as hard work. And so I do think rules can easily become twisted. They can be manipulative, and people can use them in ways that, like you said, when people are like, I'm done with the church and all its rules.
Yeah. And, I also saw a lot of judgment from the parishioners. Right. They would sit there and, they'd go to church and they'd be the holiest of holy. And then at coffee time afterwards, they'd be gossiping and bitching and complaining and carrying on. And it's just like, well, how does this work?
Right. Right. No, absolutely. It's a heart thing. And I think a lot of people don't want to do the work inside themselves, and just portraying rules and throwing them on everyone else. It just patches, their own sin. It gives them something to hide behind.
But working on ourselves.
Yeah.
If you're of the belief that God, the universe, is within us all, then working on yourself is building that relationship with your God, your higher power, the universe, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gives you, and I think when we have a purpose that's away from rules, I think what we're able to do is, this is what I call it. I call my OCD my thorn in the side. I know in the New Testament, Paul talks about it. I think my thorn in the side is there. But what I'm learning is, if I can step into this space of imperfection and away from rules that serve no purpose, whatever I'm dealing with, I can then choose to prune and to water and to clip away what needs to be clipped away. And my thorn in the side can bloom into something that someone else can point out and say, hey, there's something there worth living for. There's a reason that I'm worth showing up, and I too can get through X, Y, or Z. And I think you don't see your thorn in the side as an opportunity for growth if you live in such a rigid way that you throw shame on yourself every time you come up against something that you can't navigate perfectly, like me and my obsessive compulsive disorder.
If you think of it though, you mentioned a thorn and blossoming. Well, the first thing that popped into my head is a rose bush. Every rose bush, you're going to have its thorns, but you're also going to have the beauty in the flower.
Absolutely.
You have both.
Yeah, they're inseparable. You can't, there's beauty and ash in this life, and you can't have one without the other.
Yeah. And one teaches us about the other.
Absolutely.
So tell me about your book, Not So By Myself.
Not So By Myself. Again, crazy timing. I started writing this book 2 weeks before the pandemic. And so my publisher called and was like, hey, I don't know how long the world will be kind of so by itself, but let's get this baby out there. So it was a story I originally began sharing about my experience while my husband was gone those first 4 months, because that 4-month period, all of it is when I received all my mental health diagnoses. That's when I walked through some very scary physical health issues. I also finally had to wrestle with and decide who I thought God was. Like, I finally had to make that decision on my own, all while, dragging my dogs out of the dog park, getting kicked out of public places. And so it's my messy story of finding grace and purpose in some of the hardest spaces.
Wow. And where is the best place? Oh, actually, before we get to how people could connect, do you have any final words of wisdoms or final thoughts that you want to share with people?
I think my favorite one is, this is a little mantra I created for myself, and I have to whisper to myself on a regular basis, is that grace and perfection can't coexist. You got to pick one. Perfection will leave you exhausted, and grace will give you room to love yourself and other people.
That's perfect. That's perfect. I love it. And where can people connect with you and grab a copy of your book?
So if you want to hop on my Instagram and see videos of my dogs fighting, all the good, the bad, and the ugly, Instagram.
No dog porno, eh?
No, just them biting each other's faces off is pretty much all it is. But that's at Peyton M. Garland author. That's the quickest way to get in touch with me. I have a website, peytongarland.me, where I've actually created some OCD merch. So I have lots of OCD quote cards, t-shirts. And then if you want to get the book, the quickest way to get it is just to hop on Amazon.
To connect with Peyton and grab a copy of her book, make sure you check out the show notes. I will have all of the links in there. And Peyton, thank you so much for joining me and sharing your story.
Sure. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Roller Coaster Podcast. Want to chat or share your ideas about today's show? Pop me an email at hello@therollercoasterpodcast.com. Don't forget to connect with me on Facebook and Instagram at the Roller Coaster Podcast. Our theme song, Roller Coaster, was performed by The Lucky Setback. Audio editing by the one and only Jeff Quigley of Quigley Creator.
Life is like a roller coaster, baby, baby. I wanna ride, 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 ride. Life is like a roller coaster, baby, baby. I wanna ride, 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 ride. Roller coaster. Ride, ride. Roller coaster. Ride. Roller coaster. Ride.